Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Claudia Zini and I'm the director of Kuma International. Thank you very much for being here with us, for connecting to this third appointment with the Artists in Conversation program. We're still admitting a few people to the talk tonight. So the Artists in Conversation program wants to bring together four visual artists and photographers from Bosnia and Herzegovina who now live in diaspora. And we wanted them to discuss with us their artistic practices and insights into the work concerning diasporic art, memory and identity. I'm just letting more people in. The program was envisioned into this discussion about memory and identity and diasporic memory and art in the framework of this year's 25th anniversary since the end of the Bosnian War in 1995. So last week, we had the pleasure to hear from Belma Babic in Munich, from Anna Čvorović in London. Tonight we're here with Selma Ćatović Hughes. She's in Sharjah now, and on Thursday it will be our last event, our last talk, and we will welcome Velibor Božović in Montreal. So Selma, I think we are all ready to listen to your talk. Welcome to Kuma again. We had the pleasure to work with Selma before. Last year, she presented to the second edition of our summer school in Sarajevo. It was July. The times were different, so we could all meet in person in Sarajevo, and Selma gave like a very great talk. So we're going to do this online this year, but I'm sure it's going to be as good as it was last year. So it's an honor to have you here again, Selma, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Hi, good evening and good morning for some of you. Thank you, Kuma, Claudia. And thanks to all of you who are joining today for this ongoing discussion and conversation that post-conflict societies sort of experience over and over and have impact on so many people. I'm just gonna share my screen.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. All right, that looks good?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So today I will be presenting some of my work, which is an ongoing exploration with memory as visual storytelling. It is investigating the realm of illustrated possibilities to retell a story and kind of capture a micro moment and re-embrace the past. It's a composition of discoveries to perceive a moment or ritual, and all while exploring the boundaries and imaginary lines. This idea of unveiling and boundary and layers has always been present in some ways in my work, both in architectural work and visual arts. These projects that I'm going to talk about tonight really existed even before I knew they were there, because all these fragments of memory constantly appearing and disappearing, concealing and revealing are a big part of me. Over the past 25 years, the reconstruction of these fragments have kind of shifted scale and started at the most intimate level of using my war journals and creating this kind of a visual storyboard to representation of how one story can become part of a collective memory, and finally inserting itself in more kind of a public realm, and to educate and retrace the past. But all this work is very much malleable process, and where old memories resurface and merge with visual flashbacks. So we all have beginnings and backgrounds that influence us all, and a lot of times in very cryptic and kind of ambiguous ways that we're not even aware of. My dad, Muhammad Selma Ćatović, was born in 1940 in Sjenica. This is a southwestern part of Serbia called Sanjak. And Sanjak was very important administrative part during the Ottoman Empire. And when Bosnia became annexed and part of Austro-Hungarian Empire later on, Sanjak was actually returned to Ottoman Empire. And it wasn't until 1918 that it was divided between Montenegro and Serbia. Just like other parts of former Yugoslavia, it is with mixed population of all religions, but majority of people living in Sanjak are Muslims. My grandfather had sort of like a little merchant shop where he sold different construction materials, and was doing quite well. Unfortunately, during the World War II, it was bombed and it burned down. And this really brought a lot of stress and kind of financial headache for him, for my grandfather and the family. And shortly after the end of the World War II, he died from heart problems in 1946, leaving a wife and 3 small kids behind. My dad is in the middle. He was 6 at the time, his sister was 8, and his younger brother was 4. My dad was very athletic. He attended many sports, wrestling and skiing. And when it was time for him to go to high school, a very good family friend offered to kind of take care of him and support him anywhere he wanted to go to finish high school. And he kind of urged him to maybe pursue athletics or any kind of sports studies. But my dad expressed his desire to be a mechanic, and he wanted to come and live in Sarajevo. And so he did. When he was around 12 and 13, he came to Sarajevo, and that's where he lived for the rest of his life. Later on, he did serve in the Yugoslav Navy, and which was in Rijeka, Croatia, but he came back to Sarajevo and became a taxi driver. And then later on, of course, when the war began, he joined the Bosnian army. My mom, Nasiha Naska Ćatović, was born in 1943 in the heart of Sarajevo, in one of the oldest neighborhoods called Vratnik. Vratnik was established during the Ottoman Empire as a walled city, a fortress walled city, and the old imperial road that led from Sarajevo to Istanbul went over and through the gates of Vratnik. My grandfather was a goldsmith, and he had a jewelry shop in downtown, in the old town, Baščaršija in Sarajevo. And my mom is also one of 3 children. She's also in the middle and has an older sister and a younger brother. So my uncle was also goldsmith, and so he carried the tradition, the family tradition. And his 3 sons were as well trained and skilled in this business. However, when the war kind of started and the circumstances of the war changed so many lives and really interrupted some of these traditions. My mom was sort of a very romantic soul. She indulged in books and movies and foreign languages and music. She's also one of the first women in Sarajevo to get her driver's license. And she was a proud owner of a Fiat 500 that she drove everywhere. Her love of books and driving kind of fell in the perfect place. And for a few years, she worked for a Svetlost bookstore as a kind of a traveling librarian and delivered books to these kind of small schools and villages out of the way, mostly in the southern part in Herzegovina and some in Dalmatia as well. But she took this opportunity to capture these moments of her trips and experiences with through different places that she was traveling. And so I still have this red shoebox full of these photos that are like tiny black and white snapshots, 6 by 8 centimeters, to kind of tell that, part of history that she went through. My parents met in Sarajevo, obviously, and got married in 1972. My sister Sabrina was born in 1973, and then I came along in 1977. In September of 1991, I started high school, and my sister was in her final year. The city is sort of like an armature and really cannot be erased from the mind. It is a honeycomb with these cells where we can keep all the fragments, all the parts of the things that we want to remember. Memories, images, and immersing somebody verbally into storytelling that is into this place, which is sort of a veil created by emotions and sounds and texture and light, starts to create new memories. And these memories can be experienced exactly how they're described, or maybe your journey actually evolves into a new set of memories based on sort of intertwining with your own experiences. The past 2 or 3 days have been rough. The grenades have been falling all around my house, within 100 meters. Last night around 2 a.m., I was woken up by the horrifying detonation, and then 4 more followed. It was really awful. I'm laying in bed, listening for sounds like an animal in the jungle. I hear the initial firing, then I hear it flying over my house. And after 2 or 3 seconds of silence, I see the bright light and finally the explosion. So on my 15th birthday, everything changed. March 1st, 1992, the United Nations declared the independence for Bosnia and Herzegovina. And at the same time, the Serbs disagreed with that decision and the world, and they declared the war on the Bosnian people. For the next 3.5 years, we lived under the siege. And in my final year of high school in summer of '95, I received a scholarship to the US to pursue my studies in architecture and design. In the early years of living in the US, I was experiencing new people, new landscapes, cultures, languages, and it really wasn't that unusual that I came from somewhere else, because America is a melting pot, and people come from all these different backgrounds. At least not until I got into a little bit deeper conversation about what my country was and what it was going through. I embraced life in America, and it embraced me back, forming new memories. And years later, in 2005, I applied for a travel grant to create a project that would retrace my steps, a journey when I left Sarajevo under the siege. And that would mark like 10 years since I left. So this project, Analog Memory Digital Storytelling, was conceived as a visual storyboard combining three types of memory: the sensory, short-term, and long-term memory, all layered into sort of one complex thing. This is an ongoing project where information, visual, text, screenshots, and illustration is used to reinterpret time, place, and entangled memory. In order to compile the string of events into a long-term memory, we first have to actually reconstruct the fragments, encode them into a cohesive narrative, and then recall them as a visual and even spatial experience. There's clearly a connection between memory and time, but also the place, history, and events. You can see on this image a picture of the Doors, and coincidentally, today is December 8th, which is Jim Morrison's birthday. When I was freshman in high school, I really got into kind of the music of the 60s, and I was listening to the Doors and Janis Joplin and Bob Dylan, and I would translate their songs, and it really was sort of escape during my teenage years and war years, which clearly overlapped. You can see here in my a quote from my journal that we packed for the shelter for the first time, and everybody was packing something else. My sister was packing sweaters, and my mom was folding towels, and dad was packing food. But I was wondering what's going to happen with my Jim Morrison posters in case the house gets bombed. So as a 15-year-old living in the Claudia, can you mute somebody? Thank you. So as a 15-year-old, I think I was living under these circumstances that were very unusual and extreme. I was faced with this kind of a duality, really, of reality and living under the war circumstances, but yet being a teenager and everything that comes with that, which is emotions and feelings and reflections. So in my journal, I write, and you can see here on the screen, it says, P.S. I think I'm not even in love these days. Can you believe that? Selma Ćatović doesn't feel anything. It's unbelievable, but it's true. This war kills and destroys everything: cities, homes, streets, monuments, cathedrals, mosques, churches, although the fact is not that many Orthodox churches. And it destroys my soul. They're killing me slowly but surely. But I'm not that easy. I won't make it easy for those psychotic animals. I think one of the, over the years when I shared stories with people from all over the world, one of the most confusing things that for people is to understand how we normalize our life under these circumstances. Life went on, schools were disrupted only for a little while, so it was sort of like a long summer holiday, but they were regrouped and reorganized in neighborhood schools, in the basements or other safer areas. We had all the classes that, you know, nothing was sort of taken out. For PE, because we had to stay indoors, for the most part, we had ballroom dancing, which you can imagine I wasn't really thrilled to do, since I was sort of rocking to the Doors and inspired by Morrison's poetic expressions. My French class, there were only 3 of us, and we would go to our French teacher's house and have a class around her dining room table. At this point, also very early in the war, we started receiving humanitarian aid. And the first one that we received actually came from Italy. and then later on from France and US and other places. And these packages, these humanitarian boxes, were just so exciting to receive, and everything was exciting. We had limited supplies for food, but at the same time, we were still very creative, and we invented new recipes. We combined ingredients that we never combined before, and every time we made these new sort of concoctions, we just were convinced that it tasted just like some meal we were recreating that we ate before the war. Of course, the only difference was that it was probably missing the main ingredient. So we used we had abundance, I should say, of flour and yeast, powdered milk. And so one of the popular recipes was you mix some yeast and breadcrumbs and a little bit of water, and you kind of make a little ball, and then you fry it, and you have meatballs. And we said, hey, this tastes exactly like beef meatballs. Another sort of one that I remember, we would mix flour and powdered milk and water, a little bit of sugar, and we would sort of boil it and make it kind of into a thick paste. And then we would divide it into two parts, and in one part we would add cocoa powder. So we had a black and white, and there we go. We had Eurocrem, which is sort of our Bosnian version of Nutella. I'm sure that it tasted nothing like Nutella, but at the time, you know, we played these kind of games of power of positive thinking, and it did taste like Nutella. It was good. So again, life went on. We did things that we tried to do all the kind of normal things for everybody, from kids to teenagers to older people. I'm sure that adults worried a lot more than teenagers and kids did, but still everybody kind of went into this new normal. You can see on the screen, even in the previous one, there's some sketches here on the left of a dress, and I say that I made this cool new black dress. And then on the next one, I make a denim sort of vest. And so when we were receiving these packages from the humanitarian packages, in addition, the new kind of through Red Cross and other organizations, your family members could send you packages. So our family and friends that lived outside of Bosnia started sending us these packages. And of course, I love to get like real chocolate and, you know, real Eurocrem. But I was super excited to get like the most updated copies of fashion magazines. It was just, you know, something that was really exciting to make sure that I'm sort of on top of things, what's happening in Paris and Milan. So we sort of, you know, making clothes out of old clothes and reconditioning used things just kind of points to the fact that these were all kind of mechanisms that we use to normalize our life. And the truth is, everyone thought that, you know, this war is just gonna last through the summer, and then it'll be over. The summer will be over and the war will be over, because we didn't really know any better. And probably also because as humans, we have this kind of ongoing hope and optimism, and doesn't matter what circumstances we're in, but we hope that it's gonna be better, that it's gonna end. These diaries as written documentation, they build the foundation of not only of how we experience and process and then remember the world around us, but also how we remember people that we lost too soon. When war started, my dad was 52, and based on his age, he was qualified to sort of stay at the headquarters of the army post, meaning in the neighborhood where we lived, like 10 minutes away, and just to kind of be there during like day shifts and night shifts. But he didn't want to do that. He felt like he needed to protect his family, and in order to protect his family, he needed to go and defend his city. So on November 19th, in the morning, we had the visitors from his unit come to tell us that the day before, on November 18th, he was shot at the front lines where he was for the past 5 days. I write in my journal that sometimes I feel like this madness is never going to end, but then some strange optimism overcomes, and I convince myself that this will last only for a little longer. I hope, and I will always hope for better and happier days than these awful heavy ones. There's a Latin proverb that says, dum spiro spero, while I live, I hope. After all, we are human beings and we will fight our way out of this, but we will never forget. This is January 1993. And life went on again. Life was changed forever. My sister was 19, I was 15 and a half, and my mom was 49. So my mom was basically left to take care of her 2 very young daughters, teenagers, in the middle of the war, in all the uncertainties that you can think of. There's always been this kind of a overlapping of events that were very deep and emotional, and then again, the events that were complete opposites. So here on the right-hand side, you can read the news for my stomach. And I talk about how my stomach received something very new. It was veal that I had for lunch. And at the time, all the stores clearly were shut. Nothing was open in like a normal sense of way. There were these markets that you could go and people were selling their things in exchange for other things. But it wasn't, not everything was really available for all of us to buy, even if you had money. Another type of exchange that was happening was food, actually. So if you received a humanitarian aid, for example, and you got a can of mackerel or something that wasn't that appetizing, you would go and exchange it for something that you would rather prefer, whether it was food or if you needed shoes or a new jacket or whatever it might be, or a book for that matter. But soldiers were also paid in packs of cigarettes. And when I say soldiers, you have to remember that most of the people that were part of Bosnian army were actually civilians who just joined, right? There were some people that were actually trained and professional soldiers, but not very many. So they were paid, they couldn't pay him, right? And money, because the country was new, they didn't have that, but so they would pay him with cigarettes. And if you weren't a smoker, then you could really use this as a real currency, go to a marketplace and get whatever you needed. So my mom created her own kind of currency. And in our neighborhood, there was a small restaurant that opened up. And when I say restaurant, I mean it was barricaded room where they had some food, no menu, but whatever they can make for the day, and drinks mostly for all these people, you know, young guys who were on the front lines to come and just kind of have a couple of nights or during the day, some drinks to just sort of forget about all the things they were seeing in the front line. So the owner was kind of starting to ask in the neighborhood, does anybody, you know how to make the good desserts? And the word sort of got, the recommendation started rolling towards our house and my mom. And so she started making desserts, baklava in particular, for this restaurant. And he would buy, the owner of the restaurant would buy all the ingredients, which were, you know, special for the time: butter, eggs, and walnuts. You couldn't really find them. Plus, if you could find them, they were extremely expensive. But he would get all the ingredients, and then on top of it, he would pay her for, you know, the time that they made to make. So this went on actually for several months, and it was really great because we could then on occasion actually afford to get some veal, and I was very excited about it. Also, in this constant duality of harsh reality and then everyday life, things weren't, you know, we had fun, we gathered with friends and family, we celebrated, birthdays were never skipped. This image here is picture on when my mom turned 50 in the summer of 1993. And this delicious looking cake that you see, I made of beans. So they were cooked beans, like brown beans, sort of like pinto beans. And then with some sugar and breadcrumbs and like a baby crackers, cookies that were crushed together with some cocoa powder. And so shaped in a nice number 50. And then my sister went into our garden and picked these nice flowers. And I'm so happy that we actually captured this in a photograph, because so many these fragments of memory, if they are not written and if they're not captured in an image, they just eventually, you know, start to disappear, really. So that's, again, another example that we did sort of celebrate, found inspiration and moments to celebrate every day for something. I also remember really having the best time as a teenager in high school, because we would, a group of my friends and I would, there's probably about 20 of us, and we would frequently, I would say at least once a week, if not twice a week, we would rotate from home to home, kicking our parents out for the night, rearranging that they go sleep at, you know, aunt's house or grandmother's house. And then we would just have these parties overnight in a safe place. We were in somebody's house. All the parents knew where their kids were. And, you know, often we didn't have electricity or water. We would have acoustic guitars and we would sing and dance. In some homes, people have converted the car battery and they would hook up the wires, and maybe there was like one light, so it wasn't always candles, or they would hook it up to the radio and we could kind of hear that. So it really was so many good memories that I do have during this time growing up. And I know that sounds strange, but it really was like that. And then in 1994, so the fall of 94, now we're 2.5 years into the war and 2 years of having high school in these neighborhood schools. The government had decided that it was in the best interest of the students and the teachers to discontinue these kind of neighborhood improv schools, and that everybody should go back to their original schools. Now, if you were in high school, that meant that your high school was not necessarily right in your neighborhood. It usually meant that it was kind of on the other side of the town. And in my case, my high school was about, I lived in the new part of Sarajevo, and the high school was in the center. So it took 50 minutes walking, because there was no public transportation, nothing was working because of the bombing and shooting. So 50 minutes walking to get to high school. Then I have classes with sort of background noise of bombing and shelling, and then 50 minutes back to home. What this meant was crossing several major streets and intersections, which were heavily exposed to snipers. Sarajevo, for those of you who are not from there, is sort of like in a valley, and the Serbs were pretty much on top of all the hills, and they could see in the valley like in a, you know, palm of your hand. And so it was quite dangerous getting my, you know, chemistry lesson and making sure that I learned French and Latin really good. So absurd, but that was the new normal. But what I noticed during my final high school year, is that in the first week we were all sort of there, and then as we were getting deeper into the fall semester, I noticed that a lot of guys were kind of stopping to show up, starting to not show up in class. And at the time, obviously, all of us in high school in final years were 18, turning 19, and because of the war, if you were a guy, immediately after you finished high school, you would be directly joining the military. So I started asking around, well, where did this guy go and what's happening with him? And basically turned out that they were trying to avoid going to the military. And some of them had, family or friends that were living outside of Bosnia, but a lot of them were also trying to get a scholarship, either in Europe, but mostly in the US, to just get out. So I got the contact and I asked about who was organizing this and how, how was it possible to get a scholarship to get out of the Sarajevo. And it was organized by the nonprofit called World University Services, which is actually supported by George Soros. And they were also working with the Fellowship of Reconciliation in New York City. So I inquired about the process, submitted my application, and then in a relatively short period of time, about 2 or 3 weeks, I received a fax telling me, congratulations, you have received a scholarship in the United States. And this is the end of May 25th. I was very excited, and it was kind of mixed feelings of, am I making the right decision? Should I be leaving Sarajevo? Should I be leaving my mom and sister? At the same time, I always really wanted to kind of explore the world and learn about other cultures and languages. So it was, again, this mixed feelings. And so the first step was obviously to get the passport, because I didn't have one. So that took a little while, and you couldn't really easily get passport either, because our government in Sarajevo in particular, they didn't really want everybody leaving the city, because whether you're a woman or child, or obviously men, because if a lot of people left the city, that would just make it an easier target for Serbs to just really rush in and take over the city. But there was another problem, a big problem, how to get out. And Sarajevo was under the siege. All the roads were blocked. You could not get out of the city. The airport was closed, and the UN sort of had the control over it. So only the humanitarian aid planes would fly in, and obviously the politicians or whoever was coming in for some kind of a publicity act. So the only way to get out of Sarajevo was through the tunnel. And this tunnel was dug under the airport runway. And it was primarily meant for military purposes. But of course, eventually, small civilian groups started to use it as well, but only if you had connections. So my mom started asking, who knows who that could help me out. And it wasn't until July that one day I came home. I think the school was still in session, so I must have come home from school, and my mom says, guess what? You're leaving in 2 days. And I was like, what? She's like, yep, we figured out, we have a connection, you're going through the tunnel. And even though I knew that this wasn't happening, or hoping that this would happen, but when I heard those words and when it became closer to reality, it was just a mix of all kinds of feelings and thoughts, and probably 2 sleepless nights. So on July 8th in 1995, I gathered some stuff. I had a backpack and a duffel bag. And in the duffel bag, I had some clothes, I had some photo albums. Of course, I had my Jim Morrison poster. How could I leave that behind? And then I had several very thick math and physics books, because I just couldn't imagine, that America had really good literature and study books for math and physics. And I was concerned. I wanted to study architecture, and I wanted to make sure that I have the right study books, which is funny because, of course, later on when I did start architecture, it turned out that math and physics aren't really the big emphasis in the architectural design program, but I didn't know that in 95. So I headed at midnight, and the reason why I started at midnight is because the tunnel was the hotspot for the bombing. The Serbs knew that it existed, and they constantly bombed the entry and the exit, which was basically two houses that, you know, through the basement floor, the entry and the exit was connecting the tunnel going under the runway. And so at nighttime was the kind of optimal time, or at least less risky, to come in front of the tunnel and enter it. So you can see here on this upper left image that this tunnel is not very big. It's about 1.2 meters wide and about 1.5 meters tall, which means you can't really stand up and walk. So you had to kind of be hunched over a little bit. And it's because it's very narrow, it only is one way, right? So one group goes one direction, then the other group goes the other direction. So once we got there and waited and waited and waited, finally they let us through, all I could smell was musty kind of earth, you know, like being a worm inside this tunnel. So my mom's friend of a friend, it was actually our first next door neighbor, her brother was in military, and he organized the trip for me. So as soon as I was picked up with the van and taken to the entry point of the tunnel, there was a young guy who asked me if I was Selma. I was. He took my duffel bag and he said, "Stick with me." And I did. And so he took me through the tunnel, but halfway through the tunnel, all of a sudden they told us to stop. And they did make these kind of wider areas in the tunnel. And so we all kind of squished against the wall, because coming from the opposite direction, they were carrying the wounded soldiers through on these stretchers. And the scene wasn't like that they were, you know, covered in blood and nothing like that. They were covered with blankets, but clearly you could see kind of the anguish and really terror and sadness and just being tired coming from the front line and wounded. So that was kind of an episode that sticks in my mind, the fragment from that trip through the tunnel. And so when we got through, there were trenches at the exit of the tunnel that were all muddy. And I remember I was wearing my white All-Star shoes. They were knockoffs, they weren't real, but super happy to have them. And I just remember I could feel splashing, couldn't see it, but I could feel splashing into mud, and just thinking like, oh my gosh, I am ruining my shoes. Why didn't I not wear something else? So when I exited the tunnel, this soldier took me into another van. And this is all 3, 4 in the morning. And this time in the van was full of soldiers. And they were going to the front lines, or the areas, kind of safe areas near the front lines, to be there. So they took me in and we drove for hours, but I don't remember. I must have passed out being exhausted. And I just know that I woke up in this house with these soldiers. And when I was awake, then the same guy again took me to this town called Zenica, which is, if you look on a map, it's only about maybe 15 minutes from Sarajevo, but it took us hours because we had to go over the mountains, avoiding front lines and where the Serbs were. And so he took me to our family friend's house, where I would stay for a little while until I could go to Zagreb in Croatia. So this map just kind of illustrates my path going from home and the times that it took, then the small van, then the tunnel, and exit to Zenica. Once I was in Zenica, the next day I contacted the organization in Zagreb, and they were very excited to hear that I got out of Sarajevo, because they knew it was, you know, difficult. But then they said, "Oh, by the way, you don't have a scholarship." And I was just, what? They said, "Yeah, we send these official letters saying that, you know, you received a scholarship, so that people can start to kind of look into their paperwork and figure out ways to leave Sarajevo. But we know it takes time, so we just kind of do it in advance and hope that somebody will show up here in Zagreb." So I finished conversation with them, called my mom, and I said, I don't have a scholarship. I'm coming back to Sarajevo. And of course she said, you know, try to calm me down. And she said, you're not coming back. Keep going, go to Zagreb, everything will work out. So after a couple of weeks in Zenica, I got on the bus to go to Zagreb. And again, distance on the map between Zenica and Zagreb is about maybe 4.5 hours now, if you just go on a highway. But it took me 22 hours in the bus. And again, same reasons, because entire Bosnia was a war zone. And so we had to, the bus had to drive around all these battlefields, down to Split, and then all the way along the coast of Croatia and finally into Zagreb. Once I was in Zagreb, I went to the office and I just wanted to meet these people face to face and tell them how badly I wanted to go. And we became friends. There were a couple of girls there, Davorka and Elma, and very friendly. And I decided, you know, I'm just gonna hang out here every day when I have nothing else to do in Zagreb. So I'm just gonna come every day and be in their face, and so they don't forget about me. And so this went on for maybe a few days. And one morning when I arrived, I noticed that they were kind of shuffling some papers in their hands and talking sort of agitated. I was like, what's going on? They said, you're not going to believe this. You know, one girl received the confirmation from New York office that she has been matched with a family, because the families in the US applied to receive a student to host them. And they said, you know, and we just called her and she said, no, she doesn't want to go. And she was already in Zagreb. And I said, why doesn't she want to go? She said, well, the scholarship is in New Mexico. And she had told us, call me only if something in LA or New York City comes up. And so, you know, people take their lives and opportunity in their lives in different ways, obviously. But the three of us just kind of stood there for a second. And I think we had exactly the same thought in, you know, moments. And we looked at each other and one of them said, Selma, do you want to go to New Mexico? And I said, sure, why not? And so they crossed her name out, put my name on the paper, faxed it back to New York and said, okay, confirmed, Selma is coming. And the first thing that I did on the form that came from New York, it said Clovis, New Mexico, Clovis Community College. And so I left the office in Zagreb and went straight to the bookstore to look on the map where Clovis, New Mexico was. And I did find it. It was on the border with Texas. And then I'm looking at the map of New Mexico and I see Las Vegas. And I'm like, oh, I've heard of Las Vegas through movies. That's kind of a, you know, recognizable, nice, big town. That's good. Well, only to find out later on that Las Vegas in New Mexico is not Las Vegas, Nevada. And maybe after the talk, you can do a little bit of research and you'll see what I mean. It's this tiny little Pueblo town in New Mexico compared to what we all know from, you know, Las Vegas, the lights and flashing and all that. So that was kind of a funny moment for me to confirm once I arrived in the US. But so once my paperwork started rolling, in the process of waiting for the visa, I received the letter from my host family. And they described themselves as grandparent types, and that's exactly what they look like and what they were. Esther and Ted Van Solen had 4 kids, but all 4 kids were adopted. And so they were just very special, different kind of people, really, that I've ever met in my life, really, since. And they took me in like I was their own daughter. And so my journey for the US began. So from Zagreb, I went to Zurich and then Cincinnati, Dallas, Lubbock, Texas, where they waited for me, and then they drove me to Clovis. This is my first time on the plane. Very, very big adventure. And I finally arrived in United States. The first stop was Cincinnati, Ohio. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna call my mom just to let her know that I'm here. You know, I made this big trip over the Atlantic. She needs to know. So first step, or barrier, I should say, is how to do that. I mean, I knew some English from studying it at school, but once you get there for the first time to really use it fluently, it was challenging. So I figured out, well, if I buy something like a candy bar, I'll ask for the coins only so I can use them at the payphone. So I used my $10 bill, got some candy bar or something, and then go to payphone and I start putting in the quarters in and dial the number, and the automated message says, this conversation will cost you $9.75 for 3 minutes. Please put the remainder money in it. So I keep putting the money and I'm out of coins, and the automated message comes up and says, please deposit another 25 cents. And I'm looking through my pockets, wallet, I don't have 25 cents. And I'm like, how can this, and I'm talking to myself at this point, obviously out loud, saying, I don't really need to talk very long. I just want to say hi. And so option for talk to operator comes up, and the operator comes on and is asking me these questions, and I cannot understand them. They cannot understand me. But I managed to sort of say Serbo-Croatian, which was the language, you know, at that time we still called it Serbo-Croatian or Bosnian. It's more or less the same. And so they connect me with an operator who spoke the language. And I explained to her what was happening. And she said, look, I can't, I said, I don't have to speak for 3 minutes, just 30 seconds. I just want to hear my mom and say I'm here, everything's fine. And the lady was super nice. And she said, you know, I can't connect the call because it's automatic, but I will pick up and I will tell them that you're there. So that's what happened. My mom got the message. But it was a little bit of a sour moment for me, I guess, that my very first experience in the US was not sort of easy breezy. It was the first challenge, silly, really, but it just, you know, opened my eyes that this is not going to be without challenges, right? There is no more war, but the different set of challenges are coming for sure. And so in 2005, when I finished this project, the analog memory digital storytelling, and exhibited it in Denver, Colorado, it took everything out of me emotionally. Looking through my journals, rereading them, reconstructing these fragments into the timeline that other people could understand, it was just really too much. And so I packed it up after the exhibit, put it away, and I really wanted nothing to do with war, retelling my story, none of it. But, you know, I started thinking that if we experience these things, and one person's memory often differs from another person's memory of exactly same event that happened, that he experienced at the same time. And so the question that I sort of pondered was, you know, can we separate our intimate moments that are really having sort of individual reflection during some of these experiences from the larger sort of historical and political events that are making impact on society at the time that these events happen, and then much later as well. And so many years later, in 2018, the History Museum in Sarajevo had an open call for artists to express through their different ways of, you know, different artworks and mediums, life under the siege. And at the time, I think the timing was right for me in a strange way. I'd lost my mom. She was sick with cancer and died in 2013. And so years after that, and sort of my grieving process, going through her things, looking through her photographs and, you know, other fragments that she had and collected over the years while we were kind of in the process of cleaning up and selling her apartment, I kind of experienced sort of this anxiety attack, because I would look through some of these photos and I would try to recall the stories that she told me so many times before, and I just couldn't remember all of them in kind of a coherent narrative. And having my own kids at the time, I started to think, well, okay, how do we make sure that we can recall the past and these events, and then we don't forget. So I felt it was important that I yet again embrace another project, evolving these memories from the past and reconstructing them in another way and expressing myself in another way. Living in Sarajevo under the siege, unraveling of our lives had its own tempo, and most of the time was out of our control. And using our heritage of carpet weaving, I used that opportunity and that object and the kind of the action of it, of making it, that these unraveled threads would become voices of memory. So the process of weaving takes a very long time. It's very ritualistic, repetitive, and it actually has predetermined idea in terms of patterns and colors of what the outcome is going to be. Contrary to that, when unraveling begins, it's actually undoing everything that very rigorous and ritualistic process had done, the process of weaving, but in a much faster pace. And so the threads begin to separate, the shapes sort of dissolve, and the colors bleed against this ghost-like background. The intent of this installation was to show the intricacy that the impact of the war circumstances not only have on one person, but rather on a collection of lives that come together as a whole. And this process of weaving combines all these numerous pieces and fragments and reconstructs them back into like a cohesive narrative. And what got unraveled will be sort of rewoven again under different conditions. Unraveled was part of the group exhibit in November of 2018. And here you can see the entrance into the room, and the room that you would enter here in the museum is actually a permanent collection of facts and artifacts and objects from the life under the siege during the war. So it was kind of embedded in there. The platform in front of it that I designed was reflecting the city, so the urban fabric. And the unraveled threads, these voices of memory, the way they were sort of resolved, not left kind of ruly and unraveled, but they were actually woven back again to create this sort of siege and really reconnect different parts. Very much what we did during the war. When our lives unraveled, we picked up these pieces and put them back together in a different way, but it's still real. One of my favorite pictures and moments during the exhibit is the picture on the right, where through the white threads of the carpet, you can see the sign that says "Pazi sniper," which means "watch out, sniper." These were kind of throughout the city, everywhere in the corners of the streets or corner of the building before you go into the clearing. And so it was completely accidental, but it worked perfectly that these bare threads that got revealed because of the unraveling became this kind of a screen for the snipers, which I will talk about in a minute, that actually existed in the city. And so the intent of the art installation was to show this intricacy, and I was clearly super excited to exhibit in my hometown. But really the highlight of the project and the moment presenting it there was the fact that all of these voices and fragments of memory came together. People from a cross-section of my life, from the earliest childhood to new people that I met at the exhibit, came together, and we sort of connected in so many different ways. I had neighbors that I've known basically my whole life. There were family members. There were friends who were neighbors here in Sharjah who then had moved away to Finland. And even her mother came from all the way from the US to be part of it. So it was just really special on so many kind of levels and beyond my expectations. And it really encouraged me and gave me kind of again, hope and optimism that we can retell these stories, and there is actually a point of retelling them. And so after the exhibit of Unraveled, I got this email not long after that from Claudia, and she was introducing Kuma International and what Kuma is about, and we just kind of started exchanging conversation and planning for me to speak during the Kuma summer school. And it really pushed me to, you know, unlike the first project that I did in 2005 and then put it away for 15 years and didn't want anything to do with the war, this was kind of, you know, the momentum that kept rolling. And so I continuously started to think of other ways, you know, to expand on this memory as a visual storytelling. And you can also see this kind of shift that I talked about of scale, that it started with the most intimate object like my diary and kind of putting that together into this timeline that people could understand, to a little bit more public and larger installation like Unraveled. But Unraveled is still sort of at a scale where people have to, if they're interested, right, they will go and look at it. If they're not interested, they're not going to go to a museum and see it. They will not take that opportunity. So I started to think of what would be the way to really expose the facts of the past, and how to highlight this importance of preserving and retracing and retelling history. I continuously think of the scars throughout the city from the war. A lot of them are now invisible scars because it has been 25 years and the city has been rebuilt. But some of them, for us who lived through it, know that they're there, even though they're not on surface. And this next week, actually, on the 14th of December, will be exactly 25 years since the Dayton Peace Agreement. And, you know, I put this picture up. I think it tells so many stories, captures the absurdity of war, any war, and also absurdity of politics and people involved in it trying to resolve something that they have no idea how to resolve. You know, we had obviously at the table, we have the three main characters from Bosnia, Serbia, and Croatia sitting there and signing this agreement. And in the background, we have all the major figures from Spain, US, France, Germany, England, and Russia as sort of the backdrop. And I just find it so absurd and ironic, the fact that they're all kind of clapping as if they had done a great deal. You know, is it a good thing that the war ended? Of course, you know, people shouldn't die for any reason in the war for anybody's ideals. But has it been, the peace agreement solve problems? Not really. So back to my investigation of how do we retell the story after 25 years. During the siege, again, they were, as I mentioned, even when I was going to high school, that there were the snipers that were at all the major intersections. And if you see here on the image on the left, the hill is seen in the background, and that's basically where the snipers were. So you can imagine that they could see anybody crossing the street. And during the siege of Sarajevo, there wasn't really like a permanent wall between us, the citizens, and the aggressor, the Serbs. Like in Berlin, for example, there was never that kind of permanent wall. But the natural contour of the river divided the two sides, and these invisible screens of sniper were just so powerful as you move through the city. And you can see in these two images, the one on the right, very quickly into the war, we started blocking these major intersections with anything that made sense, from the concrete panel, as you see in the picture, to shipping containers, stacked old cars, And also the image on the right, this kind of massive fabric sheet, a true veil to block the snipers. And I think these veils of any material, but especially the one that are fabric, sort of, I think, became a symbol of resilience and the reality that people will endure and adapt to basic materials no matter what the circumstances are. The ritual and unveiling is, again, not a new thing. And for me, I've always been fascinated with veiling and unveiling. And as I said before in the beginning, that our own backgrounds and family traditions influence us sometimes even subconsciously in these weird ways. So these three photos are sort of from Bosnia and one from my dad's hometown, where women did wear different kinds of veils. So the first image, this is before the World War II, where women were, you know, wearing contemporary clothes, but they used the veil as kind of accessory. And yes, as a privacy shield, if the woman went to downtown without her husband, let's say, she wanted that layer of intimacy, right? Then during the World War II, which is the image in the middle, the women, it was always a mix, right? Because Sarajevo was a, you know, contemporary city, but there were women who started to wear a little bit more of these full body chador, to like a burqa basically, to just avoid the interaction with the German invasion, because Sarajevo was invaded by Germany during the World War II. So this was their way of kind of a shield to cover themselves and hopefully not attract too much attention, like be kind of very much anonymous and not make the eye contact and just go about their business. There's actually a story my mom told me that her father, my grandfather, who had the jewelry shop in Old Town, several times actually wore one of these full body chadors and dressed as a woman basically to go downtown to the shop and or whatever he needed to get from the Old Town, just to, again, to avoid possibility of being stopped, questioned, and so forth. And then the final picture is my grandmother, Fatima, who is my dad's mom. And this is a picture of, we think, when she was around 19, as a young bride. And I can even see in this black and white photo that the fabric is, you know, rich fabric. It's reflective, like satin, sort of. And I'm sure it was very, you know, expensive for the time and special. And this was her outfit that her mother-in-law gave her as like, welcome to the family. And so my exploration with unveiling is looking into, first as a body wrap, and during the unveiling as a ritual, what is the boundary of that it creates between the body and the fabric? What is revealed and what is that threshold between these two materials? And really there is always that kind of gap or a slit that happens between the fabric and the body. So back looking at the kind of urban fabric, the river running through as a natural divider, and the snipers, these invisible sniper tunnels or veils that are intersecting it. The river was the threshold between the two sides, and the sniper zone was this invisible barrier that actually was housed within the river. So my question, I started to develop this question of, if we were to take the river as part of the urban fabric in a city and memorialize it, what should it memorialize? Should it be for the soldiers who fought on the front line? Should it be for this kind of delicate veil of the canopy of the trees that actually shielded and protected us and sort of concealed our movements from the snipers? Actually, this part of the river that was this kind of no man's land was one of the very few parts in Sarajevo that the trees survived, because in the rest of the city, everything was cut down and used for wood in the winter because we didn't have electricity. That was, you know, having wood burning stoves was the only way to do it. So the urban fabric and the boundary, the intersection between the urban fabric and the boundary of the siege starts to kind of overlap and create these layers, both the physical layers that existed and of course this invisible layer of the snipers that existed throughout the city, but in the river primarily. So this project, Retracing Sarajevo, would start to take advantage of the veil as an idea. And instead of what veils did during the war, which they actually blocked the view to the other side, Retracing Sarajevo would actually reveal the views to the other side. This was the project that started to evolve early this year. Again, with the efforts of History Museum in Sarajevo, they sort of, again, invited artists, architects to think about how do we remember our past, how do we record our history. And so this was my proposal to have this installation on a much bigger urban scale and show these sort of veils and layers of history on the river. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, that's been put on hold. So it it's still sort of developing, hasn't had opportunity to become a real project. But these series of veils occupy this volume that was never occupied before, and they start to relieve layers of history. And again, shifting scales in my own work over the past 25 years. This project is embedded in the city and it seeks you to engage with it, right? You have no choice but to witness it. So history, memory, scars, all the fragments are out in the open and forcing you to take part of it and become sort of activated and to kind of retrace the past. Combined with written and graphic narratives, Retracing Sarajevo would allow us to imagine and feel the spaces, how they once existed under the siege, and also would explain sort of the two parallels that existed between the urban sort of context and on a human scale. So human suffering and perseverance can't really only be measured with the number of the dead and the survived. The depth of each of the personal story carries a magnitude of particular and often very peculiar aspects of one's daily life under such very extreme and extraordinary circumstances. Each of our voices is unique and it needs to be preserved and heard and repeated, if not for us, but for the future generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Selma, for this fascinating talk.
Deep breath.
It was really beautiful. I have so many, of course, thoughts and comments and questions. Please, anyone feel free, if you have any question to Selma, just type in your question in the chat box, or if you want, just please turn on your mic and camera. We're getting already like a lot of nice comments.
I'm recognizing some names of my students. That's nice to see.
Yeah, great that your students also join us. So Hannah is saying, love this. Hella, thank you for sharing your incredibly and deeply affecting story. Nihod. I'm truly at a loss for words. This brought me to tears. Agat is saying, thank you, Selma, for sharing your story of healing. Again, thank you for sharing this. Absolutely amazing professor. Bridget saying, thank you. Agreed, we're all mind blown. Wow, I'm so proud to have you as my professor. I'm so grateful, so happy that your students are here with us. That was such a great talk. And somebody else, Walker, saying a moving and valuable story. So I completely agree. And I heard the talk before last year, but it was really incredible to just listen to the talk again. Yeah, I have like different thoughts. And well, first of all, I'm really happy that you mentioned the work that you did at the Historical Museum in 2018. So I'm really grateful because the museum gave you the opportunity to show that work, and that's how I saw pictures of that work on Facebook, I remember, and then I went to see the exhibition, and then I just thought, I have to get in contact with this person, Selma, and that's how we're here today again. Bridget is actually asking if you still have the poster. I think she's referring to the
Jim Morrison
poster.
It did, Jim Morrison poster made it all the way to Clovis, and it stayed there. Unfortunately, when I moved to a different university, and I was always in touch with my host family, but just left some of the things there. Eventually, they got old and they went to retirement home, and a lot of these things were packed, and they're still, I'm sure, in their garage. It's just that I haven't been back. So I don't actually personally have it. Can you believe that? I obsessed over it for years and during the war, and then somehow it just slipped. So I don't have it with me, but I think it still lives in a box in New Mexico. Maybe it should stay there.
One of my questions was actually if you brought your diaries with you when you left Sarajevo. And then Agat is asking if you're planning to publish a book. And that was also one of my questions, like, have you ever thought about publishing your diaries? Yes, because even actually this analog memory digital storytelling was put together in a book after the exhibit. Not like, I bound it together in a format that you could read it as a book. And few people have read it. What I did after the exhibit, actually, I made about maybe 4 copies. And at the end, I added blank pages for comments. And then at the end of the book, I put my address there, and I gave it to few family members and friends, and I said, read it, give it to somebody else. When they finish reading it, have them pass it to whoever. And this was in 2005. And 4 of my journal sort of copy books is somewhere. I never received it back. I know through my mother-in-law that the copy that she had sent to a friend and then to another friend ended up in Australia, she thinks. One is probably still in New Mexico in a box, again, because my host mom had it. And then there's a couple of other books that are floating around. So I'm always waiting, the letter in the bottle kind of thing that people find after like 30 or 40 years or longer. I'm kind of hoping that somehow at least one of these copies will come back to me. With all these kind of people signed in, and at least with their name, if not the comment. But I did think about it, and I often think, because that was just a really very short part, like snippets from the books that I have. I have 10 journals altogether. Some of them were before the war, so there's probably about 6 that were written during the war. And there's just so much stuff. So it would take another editing process of going through them again. And taking the parts, that I felt like are good for everyone to read, but maybe not all of the most personal parts. That's always the kind of dilemma that I have. What was the reaction of your family members reading your diaries, if I can ask? Because you were talking about this fear of forgetting, of course, so the necessity, and this is what we've been discussing with the Velma and Anna last week, of course, the necessity of, preserving history, retracing the past, and putting together these fragments of memory that we have. But I'm thinking, so there is a fear of forgetting, but then my experience of talking to people in Bosnia would be that somebody, you know, would say that there is also a fear of having too much to remember, though people not willing, you know, you've been same like Velma and Anna last week, but you also been so generous, you know, in retelling your stories and going into details about, you know, talking about the siege, you know, and in such a, you know, so
No,
I mean,
I think one comment that sticks with me actually from that Kuma summer talk, you know, after those students had like 5 super intense days of seeing and learning basically in 5 days everything that they could possibly know about the war. A lot of it obviously very heavy and emotional. Even if you're not there, even if you don't have family members, of course it's human suffering and you connect whether you want it or not. But I remember after I had given my talk, they were like, oh, this just feels so refreshing to hear. And of course, it's not, they didn't say like, you know, that it was like a super happy talk or anything like that, but it felt that they finally were exposed to like a very normal experience. Normal, I mean that life is about mix of experiences and emotions, whether it's war or not. And so they appreciated to hear this kind of perspective, especially of a teenager, that teenager in a war was really not that different than a teenager in Italy or US or Brazil, you know, that there was that kind of connection. Another time this project was exhibited actually was just recently in February in Abu Dhabi. And that was really also unexpected. There was a visitor's book, and I had received so many comments from people around the world saying things like, you know, I've never been in such a situation, but I connected, and, you know, it kind of brought me to tears when I read through the journals. And I think the point is really when we read about another human life, again, whether it's happy or not, we connect and we try to sort of recall similar memories, right? That would really connect us with that person. So even if we didn't go through the war, but we're reading about war, we're thinking of something that was the closest, some kind of loss, some kind of suffering that we've experienced in our own life, and try to make kind of the bridge in between the two. So I think that's usually the feedback that I get. And I think there was one feedback, somebody reading all these kind of crazy things that we did during the war, you know, like going to school 50 minutes one way and back because it was better to sit at the real desk and die on the way potentially every day than being in the neighborhood home and still learn, right? But, you know, all these kind of really weird things that seem weird from the outside, obviously. I remember this person saying, like, I just don't get it. Like, I'm trying to understand it, but I just don't understand why you guys did these things, you know? So it is, I think it's a lot of different reflections, people, but I think at the end of it is that we all try to kind of connect with some parts of it with our own experience.
I have to read you a few more comments, and then there is a question from Hella. So first of all, Enrico is thanking you, Selma, for your touching talk and sending you big hugs from Paris. Lovorica is saying, thank you, Selma, very familiar, very moving. Lana is sending hearts. Anna is saying, thank you for sharing such a thorough and engaging story of the war period and your life. Victoria, thank you, Selma. I'm lost for words after listening to your story. Thank you and congratulations for your work. A very brilliant elaboration of your story and everything a war can be. And then there is a question from Hella. I wonder how you exhibit your memory works. The mix between subjective and narrativized memory seems to demand a specific kind of installation, and it reminds me a little of the Hanging and the War Childhood Museum, which uses curatorial strategies in a specific way. So she's mentioning Hela is mentioning the War Childhood Museum here in Sarajevo.
When I sort of thought of this, the first project that I did, I envisioned it as a very linear kind of process or procession through the exhibit space. And, you know, both in the way the pages were laid out, there was that timeline at the bottom that just sort of repeated itself over and over, and plotting these dates, whether they were personal dates, that something that I wrote about in a journal, or more kind of on a international scale, like I have a date for the Olympics in Barcelona that summer, and other sort of world events that were happening, Jim Morrison's birthday and things like that. So it was kind of this parallel of the intimate and the more kind of global events that were happening. And so to me, it worked to be also a linear experience. So the room was actually, the walls were lined and kind of brought you in around. And then I created this kind of central, almost like a core that brought you in the middle, where I had larger panels of my kind of tunnel exits, that journey that took, the steps that I took literally from my home all the way to Clovis, New Mexico. So it kind of, I think it was probably a little bit, also had a meaning of being exposed at first, right? As a very open way to experience this thing. And for me, a very open way, or unexposed really, to be exposed to people that I didn't know and to read these things about my life. But then it ended in this very much kind of sheltered and concealed space that not only finalized the tour, but it also meant really to be kind of intimate and to make that connection between opening up to a public, something that's very, very intimate and personal.
We have a couple of questions from Lana. She's asking you, what was the name of the dog that was with you in the shed and was shaking when the grenades fell? And Mom says you bathed in the toilet at a temperature where there were icicles on the tiles. Is it true?
This is my niece.
Right.
No, Lana. So the dog's name was Lordi. And he was a little puppy that we had during the war. I think that was the one. And Sabrina, my sister, is absolutely right. I claimed after the war that during the winter, right, the temperatures in Sarajevo, as you know, it's extremely cold and it snows and everything. And so most of the time we didn't have electricity and water. And so we just used the wood burning stove to cook and warm. Everything was in one room, right? And so we would heat up these big pots of water, take the pot of water and then mix it with cooler water to take baths. Well, I had long hair, right, always. And I said something in conversation with my mom after the war, when we were talking about things like this, how extremely cold it was during the winter. I said, I don't think I ever washed my hair during the winter time. And she said, what are you talking about? Of course you washed your hair during the winter time. I was like, no, I don't remember. I don't remember sitting in the cold bathroom in the tub pouring, I remember sort of maybe some showers, but definitely I don't remember washing my hair, because now when I think about it, I would think that I would be an icicle, right? Just attempting to do it, because the bathroom was sort of at this north corner of the house and it was not heated ever, right? Only when we had electricity, we'd put a little heater on, but otherwise it was never heated. So I imagine that I didn't use it very much and very long. And the tiles were sort of crystallized. So you could sort of like, if we had bugs or whatever, they could ice skate on our wall. So it is true. It is true.
Barbara is saying that I have read your diary, but hearing your words is so moving. And I agree with Barbara. And Mariam is saying, at times people forget that war affects the people, not the political figures. And this talk in the analog shed light to that. I'm at loss of words and amazed at the same time. And I also agreed with her.
Yeah, Miriam, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think you drew a good parallel here in conclusion. And that was why I decided to put that picture of those politicians sort of, clapping and congratulating for the peace agreement signing, because yes, it was necessary, but at the same time, you know, they are not just that group, but any politicians are completely disconnected from reality and what is actually good for the people and what is not good for the people, which means that the resolutions that they come about are on so many levels just not right. And when they're applied, often forcefully applied, it causes just more issues long term. And I think that's the case with Bosnia.
So also Velibor is saying hvala puno, Selma. Because I was thinking, Selma, so it's been, you know, you left Sarajevo, it was 1995, so exactly 25 years ago. Yeah. And then it took you 10 years until 2005 to put together that first work, you know, talking about the war, everything, what happened, your diaries, memories. And then, so, and that was painful. It wasn't like an easy task for you, right? And then you said after that, like for many years, you actually didn't want to deal with that subject anymore. And now we are talking about that again. It's 2020, it's been 25 years. We are thinking about, you know, this 25th anniversary since the end of the war. So how do you, plus you're not living in Bosnia, so you've been away for so long. So how is it to look at Bosnia from the Emirates where you live, and how is it to look back at memories that, you know, these fragments of memories that you've been collecting so painfully, actually?
Yeah, I mean, it really was, I think, you know, they say that it really takes time for something to settle, especially these very kind of dramatic and huge events and historical events that have impact on society, not just individuals, but whole societies. And so the first project, when I did it, I sort of, you know, I was still a student, and I had that frame of mind that, you know, ooh, this is just another cool project, and I, you know, get to exhibit it. And I was sort of excited, I think, a little bit for different reasons. Of course, I want to tell my story, and I knew what I wanted to say, but I just wasn't ready. And it clearly caught me off guard. And I vividly remember working on these panels with diaries on the side, you know, scanning them, translating them, and in tears, like typing, photoshopping, and just bawling till like 3 a.m. I think my husband was concerned at that point of how this was going to end. And so it just wasn't, again, we all go, you know, life has, nothing is accidental, right? It's not just a silly coincidence that it's December 8th today, right? I truly believe in numbers and these reoccurrent dates and events that happen. So in 2005, I did intentionally schedule the opening of the exhibit on November 18th, which was the anniversary of my dad. And that was clearly a mistake in terms of emotions, right? It was just, I drew this whole kind of parallel, you know, world with me, more than what it was on the walls, but I wanted for him to be there and to see it. And he wasn't, right? And so for that, I wasn't ready. But then in 2018, you know, again, it was a different, I think I obviously matured. I had my own family at that point, my kids. And that just brought a whole different perspective to me of why I needed to continue to do this. And probably even more so because I don't live in Bosnia. You know, I know that life in Bosnia is not easy. It's very complicated. And most people that do live in Bosnia, I would say majority, really doesn't want to hear anything else about the war and how it was and why it was and what were the consequences. But me, sort of from the outside, you know, we have to learn of kind of the experience from before in order to continue forward. And I think that's probably the biggest, I don't want to say mistake, but probably missed opportunity when the peace agreement was signed and how the country was given or not given this platform opportunity to continue, right? Everybody was very quick, both internally in Bosnia and from the communities, from the outside, from international sort of support. everybody rushed in just to kind of clean everything up, you know, to cover up this scar and that bombed out building, to sort of just make this visual recovery. But the healing on the inside was completely neglected. And so then 25 years later, you have people that don't want to talk about war because they just can't really take it. They can't really handle it emotionally. And they don't really see the point because it's been so long ago and they don't want to go back to that place. But that should have happened much earlier, right? And not wait. So that's why I think for me, it has always been that, you know, I just remember when I was a kid and in school, you know, during Tito communist Yugoslavia, we learned over and over and over about the World War II, about the partisan movement and everything that Tito did. It was never too much. It was never, oh, that happened a long time ago. We just studied, and we learned what that history was. So it's just insane and absurd that this history is not being told to these new generations in a way that will help them live their life sort of more embedded in this new society.
Absolutely. There is another question for you, and I'm really sorry if I'm going to mispronounce the name, Nihod, I guess.
Najud.
Sorry, I'm really mispronouncing your name. I'm really sorry. So the question is, how did you persevere and adapt to all the difficult and uncertain situations you went through? In retrospect, how were you able to make peace with the struggles, and how would you describe the idea or your experience with belonging?
You know, I have to say, listening through these kind of online talks that we had first in October for Architecture Month, and then last week with 2 other artists, maybe because, yes, I left Sarajevo, but it was really my decision. I didn't have to leave. I wasn't sort of forced to leave as a refugee or displaced person. So that maybe has something to do with it, because I knew my family was always there, and they still are, and I always have that connection. But at the same time, when I went to US, I wanted to make that my new home, no doubt, from day one. You know, I wanted to speak perfect English so nobody would ask me, oh, you have such a cute accent, where are you from? I hated that question in the first semester. I just was like, my answer would be, what did I say wrong? Tell me how to say it correctly. Because I just wanted to blend, not because I didn't have my own identity, but I just wanted to be part of this new, you know, life and the community that I was with. And I think part of the reason is because people were from everywhere. And I just felt like, you know, I can be from anywhere, but I can also be part of this. So for me, the identity always stayed with me. I never sort of denied or, you know, questioned it in terms of, just because I don't live in Bosnia or I'm not experiencing something, you know, that I don't feel that connection. Plus, I always went back every year to visit my family and friends. So for me, the identity of being sort of displaced Bosnian was really never an issue. And it's even to this day is not. And I feel sometimes even more connected actually because I'm physically disconnected from the place. I remember years ago, you know, you have a lot of people that have left the city for whatever reasons and spent a few years living somewhere, learning another language. And, you know, they come back and they start speaking Bosnian. You know, they lived in Bosnia for, let's say, 18 years at least, if not longer. They go live for a few years. They come back to Bosnia and all of a sudden they forget Bosnian. They're like throwing in these foreign words in it. And I always found it sort of fascinating, you know, like, can you really forget the language, your mother language that, you know, of course, when you're a child, different story, but as an adult, to be so influenced and kind of disconnect from that, you know? So I don't know, it's just, I remember one time when my mom and I were talking and over the phone actually, and I said some really like old Bosnian word and she just started laughing. She's like, I don't even know how you can like remember and recall this word because, you know, I wasn't using it. This is when I was a student. Nobody around me spoke Bosnian. So I think some of these things, I would say for myself personally, my identity being a Bosnian and feeling, Bosnian is strongly embedded that, it is here and is here to stay. But part of it, I think, because I never shied away or saw a problem that would jeopardize to be also embedded in another culture, right? Whether it's US and even here now, this is our 11th year in the UAE. And, I sort of like to take the opportunity and sort of become part with the place, language and culture.
I was thinking when you sent me your biography that we used to promote the event, that you didn't describe yourself as an artist nor an architect, but you wrote that, you're a war survivor and an immigrant, and that was also very interesting for me to see. And then before you were talking about, of course, the challenges that you met when you first moved to the US. So not being able to speak English at the phone or being able to call your mom. So I was just thinking about, of course, you must have had, many challenges, even if you immediately probably felt at home with your new family in the States. And now I was thinking about Velma last week, how she was saying, and also, everyone has different experiences in life, of course. And Velma was saying the other week how she never really felt at home in Germany, like her new home after leaving Bosnia, but also she doesn't really feel at home when she comes here. So we were talking about this word, this Bosnian word, stranac, this, how you're like a stranger in your home country, but then you're also a stranger in your new country, like for Velma, Germany. But this seems not to apply to you somehow.
No, I never really felt that way. And like I said, I think it was like that when I was a student. It was like that when I kind of entered more professional world. And certainly, now when I have my own kids, from day one, I spoke Bosnian to them. They're kind of slacking these days and they want to use more English than Bosnian. But, it's still, they hear it, they're exposed. And I just always felt that, they're part of me and therefore they need to be part of Bosnia, whether they want to be or not. And so I think it's just, of course, we all go through different experiences. And I think, this question about, do I want to tell my story, journals and publishing the book? For longest, I just felt that my story was just not sad enough. Like it had a good ending. And so who would read the book that, okay, you've lived through the war, but look at you now, everything worked out fine, Honestly, I always felt like when I read so many different, either true events or inspired by true events throughout different wars from different authors. And it is always, for the most part, such a big struggle and loss. And I'm not saying, of course, I experienced that with very personal, obviously my dad died. We had, cousins who were injured, friends that died. A lot of family struggle in a way. But I just kind of compare myself with other people in Bosnia that had to leave their home. I never had to leave my home. And so that's probably one of the reasons why I feel, always felt that there was the true something just holding me down no matter where I am. I knew that I was never really kind of ripped out of it, right? And disconnected violently and forcefully. So maybe that also has something to do with this kind of identity that I feel strongly, sort of, that it doesn't have these issues of whether I feel a foreigner wherever I'm living now or in the US, and then when I go back home, I don't feel that. And I think it's also maybe the perspective that I've decided to take on, of feeling that way when I'm in Sarajevo.
I think it's very interesting what you were saying about, thinking, maybe I didn't suffer enough, I didn't, my story is not that sad. So why should I now, share it with other people? And I've been hearing, similar conversations with other artists or friends here in Sarajevo, especially when they go deep and then they create these works that are very, personal and with a lot of facts from their lives. But the first question before even starting to work on a new piece would be like, who am I to tell the story, why my story would be interested to anyone. And also in the text that you send us together with your biography, you know, when you say that you are a war survivor and an immigrant, and you said my story is not unusual, meaning of course there are like so many other people in the world that share, you know, very similar experiences, and still you say that every voice is unique and needs to be heard. So I guess this is also, you know, one of the point why we are having this program, this conversation at Kuma, just to give the opportunity to everyone, you know, to express their stories. There is a comment from Velma. I never said that, or maybe I said something wrong about Velma not feeling at home in Sarajevo in Germany. So she's saying, I never said that. Instead, it seems that the Bosnian people often don't accept the idea that not living in Bosnia doesn't mean that I am less Bosnian. My identity didn't change the same as Selma says. I agree with that. I refer to that most of all to Bosnian society and their relationship to diaspora. Thank you so much, Selma, for your great talk. Yeah, I'm sorry, Velma. It wasn't Velma not feeling at home, but mostly, you know, the other Bosnians.
Perception, really, the perception that you get. And that can be, you know, a lot of time, because especially if you share your political views or questions, you know, how things could get better in Bosnia. Of course, the first response you're going to get is like, what do you know? You don't live here, which is true. You know, we can't really know exactly what the people are going through because we're not experiencing it firsthand.
Yes. I think I have only like a last question. You were mentioning the last project that you started to work this year, again with the historical museum, but then you had to put that on hold because of the current pandemic. Yeah, my question is just if you can tell us a bit more about that project. And yes, now it's
yes. So for the 6th of April, which is the sort of Sarajevo Day, but it also again plays that date, the 6th of April, repeats through the history, right? First, it was invaded by Germany, and then it was liberated on April 6th. And then this war, actually, the actual shooting, the siege sort of started March 1st. And then there was this kind of in-between time of March and early, the first week of April, when actually the Yugoslav army was just repositioning themselves. So they were leaving all the kind of barracks, military barracks in Sarajevo and around Sarajevo, and just taking all the military equipment and going up the hills and just turning around the tanks and pointing toward the city. So it took them 5 weeks to do that, right in front of our noses, basically. So the first kind of real shooting and actually the peace walk happened on April 6th. So this date keeps repeating. And so this year, the History Museum kind of, again, organized this 25-year remembrance of that date. And they really are trying to embrace people in this question of history and how do we retell, because it's not just even the war history of this recent war. It's, you know, Sarajevo went through so many different empires and governments and movements that all of that is sort of layered in our urban fabric, both spatially with architecture that exists, but also how people sort of experience that with their family stories and traditions and stories being retold from those times. So I very much kind of am interested in that, continuing the conversation again for the next generations, because from little that I've been kind of exposed, so many young people in Bosnia simply do not know about this war. And so I feel the fact that I was part of it and that I have this opportunity, 2 different platforms, History Museum and of course Kuma International, to share not just my story, but to try to reconstruct these events that will be recorded and stay forever. And so that every new generation can look back and just simply know about it. You know, there isn't really a war in the world that I know of that has been, of course, some facts change depending who is presenting them, but generally speaking, you know, wars and these events, major historical events, are documented. And so I think it's really important to put, and yes, of course, we have museums. There's History Museum and there's the Childhood War Museum, which are excellent and very proactive in delivering this constant information to the public. But most of the time, it is still up to the public to actually go and engage themselves into these events, right? If you don't go to the museum, you're not going to find out about it. So I feel like there's something that needs to be some radical, major sort of urban, on an urban scale impact that is out in the open, embedded and woven in the city, that tells these stories. You know, we have the Sarajevo roses that kind of signify the scars, which is, I'm glad that they exist. We have those plaques that show when people were, you know, certain major massacres that happened throughout the city, which is also a good thing to have, meaning informational, and it should be there. But it needs to be something a little bit more that people can't get away from it. You know, that they have to, little kids ask questions about everything. So if you have an installation like Retracing Sarajevo in the middle of the most pedestrian and used part of the city, they will ask, what are these sheets? What is this hanging? What does this say? You know, kids are the ones that are asking the questions. They want to know. Adults, yeah, they want to ignore it because they have a million other things to worry about. But it's these young generations that want to know and that are asking the best questions. Often we're not giving them the best answers. And so I'm just hoping that this will really develop into something more that to be useful for years to come.
Thank you, Selma. If anybody else has any other question for Selma, please just feel free to shoot them. If not, we will slowly conclude this great event tonight. Thank you so much, Selma, for this incredible talk. Thank you so much to all the people, like so many people that join us tonight. I really hope that I will see you on Thursday. So it will be our last appointment. We will talk with Velibor Božović in Montreal. So Thursday, the 10th of December, 6 o'clock Sarajevo time. And I really hope to see you again then. And I don't know, Selma, if you have anything else you would like to add. Really grateful again.
Well, you know, again, just thanks. I really appreciate, again, this is sort of my most kind of, I guess, thankful part that I feel as, you know, again, as an artist, as an individual who is sharing story, because similar to, as I pointed out during, at the end of the exhibit for Unravel, where all these people came in and felt like this completely unexpected reunion that went sort of cross-section of my lifetime, meeting and talking and remembering all kinds of funny episodes throughout the life. Even though, you know, here we're in a digital online world and not everyone is, you know, actually turning their mics on and speaking, and I understand that and respect, and it's fine. But I'm just really happy to see so many familiar and well-known and dear friends and family names that, you know, just really appreciate your time, taking your time to kind of join and really be part of the conversation, and just being a listener. You know, that's the first step in everything we do as people. We have to listen, and then things happen. So thanks again.
Enrico is suggesting that one day around coffee we'll share our experience about showering in Sarajevo in wartime.
I'm sure Enrico has good stories about the winter in Sarajevo.
And he's already thanking you for your talk. So Selma, I think I will let you go. Thank you so much again. Thank you to all the people that followed us tonight. See you Thursday. And Yeah, what time is it in Sharjah? I'm sorry, I'm completely lost track.
It's almost 11. Yeah, it's almost 11.
Right.
Which
So,
is, you know, we've been the pandemic and quarantine has changed everything. I used to go to bed pretty much at 9 o'clock, but now it's like we're always in the house, and everything is you can take a nap anytime you want. Not that I do it during my class ever, for students, just to be sure. But yeah, I mean, it's just, you know, everything is sort of this new normal, and I'm sure kids are still, they were awake. I don't know if they're still up. So it's fine. I'm
thank you so
happy.
much. Yeah, also for taking the time to be with us. I mean, so late during the day. Agathe is saying thank you both and good night to you all. Hannah, thank you so much, Professor. This was amazing. Miriam, thank you. Trof, thank you so much, Professor. Thank you for sharing your story, Professor. I think your students are going to love you even more after this talk.
Yeah, maybe tomorrow's class is going to be interesting, unrelated to our design topic.
Yeah, let me know about if you hear any
Yeah.
feedback tomorrow. Also, Velma is saying thank you, both Claudia and Selma. See you on Thursday. Thank you, Velma. And sorry again if I misunderstood what you said the other time. Okay, I think it's time to say good night.
Yes. Good night, everyone. Laku noć.
Laku noć.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Ciao.
Thanks,
Thank
Selma. Bye.
Thank you,
Ciao.
everyone. Ciao, Selma. See you Thursday, hopefully. If you
Yes,
can join us.
yes, for sure.
Okay, great. Good.